And that moves us onto our discussion agenda. And number 16 is discussion of proposed revisions to Board Policy IJK, supplementary material selection and adoption as seen in Exhibit H. And Ms. McCaskill?
Okay, I put together a few slides to try to help us with this, just to review exactly what we just talked about, how all three of these policies come together. You've got your KEC, which is the overall arching policy that goes along with Regulation 43-170 from the state about the supplemental materials and parent complaints about materials and what they have to go through, what types of processes we go through for that. Then we have KECR that gives even more specific details about that process. IJK is what we're going to talk about now. That's classroom supplementary materials. And then IJL is the library and instructional materials for the library. So we've gotten through the KEC and the IJL and IJK. Last time we talked about really wanting to get some more input from teachers about what IJK, what we don't want to hinder them from using supplemental materials. We know that they have to do that, and so we want to make that as easy but yet comply with the law at the same time. So we have gone to an IJLR, sorry, I missed that one. So here is what we currently have for IJK. We're looking at utilizing the PLC process, and that's what's just currently under the proposal. Tonight, you're going to see a few other things that maybe we could talk about, but right now, currently, the proposed policy has the policy using the PLC process for teachers to use that to help them approve their supplemental materials based on the 5 criteria that the law outlines. And then, of course, you'll see that still we have the information about academic freedom, that still takes any bias, anything that's going to be controversial, still has to go to the principal for approval because that's a different policy. That's the academic freedom policy. So that's what we currently have in the proposed policy. Last Thursday, we were fortunate enough to meet with our faculty advisory committee, which, as you know, is made up of our teachers of the year. There's 2 per school, so it's the previous year as well as the current year. And we had some discussion around IJK, and then I gave them a survey for them to complete and give us some input. And I'm going to share that input with you tonight. So the first question, it cuts it off a little bit, so I'm going to read what the question actually says. Based on your experience with PLCs, rate the level of hindrance that the current proposed policy would have on your use of supplemental materials. If this process were used, lesson plans and any PLC notes would be considered documentation for the process. And you'll see here 1 is a low hindrance, 5 is a high hindrance. So you'll see here where you've got about 16, and there, at this point there were 33 people who had responded. By the time I turned it off, it actually had 34. So there's 1 that didn't get included here, but same data. So you'll see that PLC process looks like maybe a hindrance, according to this survey. So the next one says, based on your knowledge of the original process from the beginning of the school year, where principals had to approve all supplemental materials, rate the level of hindrance that process had or would have had on your use of supplemental materials. And each school did have their own method of documenting this process. Again, 1 is low hindrance, 5 is high hindrance. 27 out of the 33 were 4s or 5s, so there was a pretty large hindrance there. The next question, if teachers were given the autonomy of utilizing the criteria set forth in State Board Regulation 4370, which of the following, find my paper, which of the following would be best for the documentation process for compliance? Choose as many as you agree with. So the form and spreadsheet had 0%, lesson plans documenting had 13 votes. This last one you have not heard about yet. This is something, honestly, as I was just trying to think creatively about what could we do to give a low hindrance to teachers. And every year at the beginning of the year, we do presentations with the vector solutions. And we do presentations like the staff handbook. We do presentations where they might learn about bloodborne pathogens. So there's lots of different presentations that they go through, and then they could take a little quiz, or it's just a place where they initial that they agree with and understand that that is the expectation for them. This was pretty popular because we could easily do a presentation outlining the expectations of what supplemental materials should cover. And then once the teachers sign off on that, they're saying that they agree that whenever they choose a material, they are going to ensure that they are following the law. So that was pretty popular. There was one person that said none of the above. And then the last question simply was, which option do you feel is best for assisting teachers with ensuring compliance of supplemental materials to State Board Regulation 43-170? So 30% said the PLC process, and I have exact numbers if you need those, but 30% said the PLC process, 66.7% said the individual teacher approval, and I think it's like 1% that said, it's one person, but that's 2.9% that said the principal approval. So there were 11 for PLCs, 22 for the individual teacher approval, and then 1 for principal approval. So that's some input that I was able to gather from our faculty advisory. I would propose that we might consider this as being really important information. I do feel that the vector solutions is something that we could do and do well to ensure that our teachers know what they're expected.
All right, I'm gonna go down the line. Mr. Scully. Oh, sorry, I looked that way. I can go with Ms. Snipes, ladies first.
Thank you, Ms. McCaskill, particularly for sharing the faculty input, because that's something that I was concerned about. I just had a couple of questions. So with the vector option, I know we're just kind of hearing about it for the first time, that they seem to like. Once they do that, does that, for lack of a better word, circumvent some of these other touch points that they're concerned about right now? And then I know you're telling us, like, we should really consider the faculty input, and I definitely agree. So are y'all going to use some of that feedback to kind of help shape a proposed policy, I'm assuming?
We can. Tonight I was hoping that you all could kind of maybe make a motion or tell me that that's what you would like for me to do, and then I can recraft. Give me permission to recraft that and possibly put, if you want the vector solution, that's what I could put, but give me some guidance as to which direction you would like me to go with that.
Okay, and then just one other thing. This is an eye-rolling question, but it comes up every time. On the sections for review, in the last sentence says any material that's deemed controversial, and I feel like that's always a contentious point because that looks very different. Obviously, there are some things that I feel like you just know is controversial. I don't feel like we have to have a debate about it, but have we thought about how it's going to be defined otherwise? And so in some districts, not looking at us specifically, but just generally, in some districts, teachers are being hammered because maybe parents have an issue with like the history lesson that, quite frankly could be on racism or slavery or whatever. And I would argue that that's not controversial. It's just history. but somebody else could feel a certain type of way. And so how are we defining what controversial actually is?
So we haven't given it an absolute definition, Ms. Snipes. I think you're right that it is one of those almost vague types of things. I think what we have to help teachers understand is they know their students, they know their families, they know the areas that are controversial, and so that I know that makes me uneasy. It makes me uneasy, but there's real no definition at this point. So if that's something that you'd like for us to work on, we certainly could work through that. It would be hard to list every specific topic.
As a personal touch point, I don't like how it feels, if we're being transparent, when we say, well, teachers should think about their audience, and, because if it's history, it's history. It doesn't matter who's in the class or what, community of students we're talking to. And so I don't know that that's fair, which is also another hard word to define. And so I just think that that's something that, we need to look at more. I'm asking
I can look into
of
that.
us.
I can look into that.
Mr. Scully?
Yeah, thank you. And kind of to follow up with Mrs. Snipes' questions, I may be asking the same thing that she asked, just more specifically, but are you confident that, I think the vector solutions is a very intriguing and good approach. I would feel like I would strongly support that. I like the broader approval and kind of broader certification to cover everything instead of micromanaging every single material. Are you confident that that approach would fully comply with the state law and the requirements so that we would not have any issues in the future?
Actually, Dr. Ross and I looked at several things today for another reason. And I'll tell you, the memo from the state, I'm going to read the words, what it says. Because I do think that the way that this is written, it just says that we have to have a process. So it says identify a designee or designees and or a process to ensure that all new locally approved instructional materials comply with the definition of age and developmentally appropriate prior to being made available to students. So it doesn't say who, it doesn't say what, it just says there has to be a process. So I feel like that is a process that we are putting in place.
Yeah.
Is it a really broad one? I have to say yes, it is, but I do think it's a process.
But broad it's actually very common in a lot of other industries as well. I mean, when you compare it to that, it's leaving the professionalism up to the teachers, and I think it makes sense to do it that way. The one thing that I did strongly agree with you on the PLC approach, though, was the kind of the second layer of protection for teachers. So I think that's very important to have, but it's really up to them. I mean, in your discussions with them, did you ask the question or get feedback from them regarding if they would feel protected under a broader approach without a PLC or a second layer of review? Because I think that's critical in today's environment.
I think there were 13 that said PLCs was their first choice on this. And there's a question after each of these questions for them to give input, and so I actually have a spreadsheet with all of that on there. Those who wrote about PLCs, that is what they wrote about, was that it gave them that sense of protection, that they didn't feel like they were on their own. Yeah. And it was really split. You could, and this is anonymous, but I could tell, just because I know teachers, I could tell who was elementary and who was secondary. Our elementary teachers felt much better with the PLC process. Our secondary teachers, because they teach so many different levels and so many different types, like subjects, courses, I guess is the best way to say that, they might be in a PLC for one course, but they're not in the PLC for another course. So they felt like that would cause too much issue for them to be able to, they wouldn't necessarily get to every PLC for that approval. And so that's where that split came with, but you're right. The ones that were in favor of PLCs, they thought having that team approach gave them that comfort.
Yeah, and hopefully, and this information has kind of swayed me towards the vector solutions kind of broader approach, because I was on board with you on the PLC for that reason. But I don't think we need a motion for her to. So
We're having a
I'll just
discussion.
ask you to please bring us an option with the vector solutions type of approach. And thank you. I appreciate
Mr. Satterfield?
Yeah, I think there's the reason that you got, first of all, I appreciate you going to the Faculty Advisory Council. I think that's a great idea. You know, I'm always about asking teachers, if we're going to ask them to do something, we should ask for their input. Your comment about the elementary school teachers, what elementary school teachers typically have group planning. Secondary do not. So I want you to imagine that you've got 100 teachers in your building. They go home that night, and they write up lesson plans, and they add everything, the supplementary materials, and they're researching at night, and they're doing their stuff during their planning, which is usually by themselves, and then they put a lesson plan together, and then they're scrambling with to find their PLC, which typically high school teachers don't have. They have a department head, but they're scrambling now, and if they don't get it approved, do they not teach the lesson that they worked all evening on? So elementary school teachers, all the kids go to special areas at the same time for that particular grade level. I've worked at all 3 levels, so I know how that works. And elementary teachers are that nature. They feel comfort in that. But secondary teachers are such a disadvantage, so there's no real PLC opportunity. So, and I always get back to the idea that we have so many teachers that are teaching electives, and they might be the only one teaching that class. They might be teaching a research class, and the other teachers won't have a clue what they're even talking about or what they're doing. I think a simple way of wording that is that I like the vector solutions thing. It's kind of like bloodborne pathogens. Just watch it at the beginning of the year and get it out of the way. But simply, teacher will choose supplementary materials based on the following, and you got the list of the following that are required by the state. That shows that helps teachers, it aids them, and it shows them that you trust them as professionals as well. So that's my opinion.
Anybody else? Ms. Huddle?
Thank you. I appreciate that you did this and that it's extremely valuable information. I agree with Ms. Snipes. I think we need a definition of controversial. And then I guess a question, would there be a IJKR to spell out the vector? Because that could change down the road. There might be a different tool. So, I mean, I guess 2 areas that I was thinking that a R might be helpful was with the vector and with, I guess, the documentation, which is related to the vector. And also, if it goes, if a teacher wanted to bring something to the department chair, team lead, which then goes to the school API or principal, I would think we would want that documented so that if somebody raises their hand, 9 months later and says, I'm not happy with this, we know that the API or principal approved it. And the same thing with the controversial. So I'm just wondering if there's some pieces of this that belong in an R policy to kind of cover the procedures side of it.
Anyone else? Ms. Barnhart?
I'll echo everyone. I thank you for doing this and bringing this other option, thinking creatively and finding that. It seems like that would probably reflect the opinion of a lot of the teachers in the district, and it's always valuable to hear that. The vector solutions option or something like it would just basically be something signed at the beginning of every year, carry out throughout the year, sign again.
That's right, every year.
And then what would, if those expectations were broken for some reason, would the process of that be kind of the same as the one within the DOE's suggestions, or how would we handle that at our level?
It really becomes a personnel issue if we don't follow the right, if the policy's not followed, then, and that's proven, then Dr. Turner would be involved with that. HR would be involved with that.
Anybody else? I'll say, I feel like I need to see what this looks like in a policy. I don't know that I'm 100% on board with it, but I want to see what it looks like. I think I'm a little bit worried about having something at the beginning of the year, as to what Ms. Barnhart said. I just need to see it, and maybe like an example of how that would, how it would be applied in this policy. Does that make sense?
Sure. I can certainly do something
Because
like that.
we've shifted, like the pendulum has gone all over the place with this policy. So, I mean, I think I've said a few times, I don't know where I am on this because it's hard to implement. There's a lot of different opinions on this. So I think in discussion, seeing it in policy, I might.
I can certainly do that. I can work on changing some language in the actual policy, and then I can work on an IJKR and see if that makes it clearer, rather than having it all within the policy,
Okay.
and then bring that back.
Okay. I feel like that's kind of been the consensus among the whole board, so. You've done a lot of work. We appreciate you bringing in the advisory and continuing to tweak it as we all kind of flesh it out. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you, Ms. McCaskill.
I appreciate your time with it, because it's something that I think if we don't get right, it could be really negative for teachers.
Right, right.
Which in the end is negative for students, so that's
Right.
not what we want.
Right. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. All right, that moves us to the discussion of proposed revisions to Board Policy JICJ, cell phones, communication devices, and network access, as seen in Exhibit I.
Our Chief of Student Services and Planning, Dr. Harris, will come to the lectern and present our cell phones, communication devices, and network access policy discussion.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ross, members of the board and our community. You have before you our current policy, JICJ, and a revised policy as provided by the School Boards Association, which is entitled Prohibition of Personal Electronic Devices During the School Day. I would take liberty to highlight that, since we have some persons in the audience and those who are listening by way of virtual options. This revised policy is to create, an attempt to create, rather, a phone-free school environment, and it is a policy that governs students grades K through 12. The proviso that initiated all of this is listed there, and which is entitled Anti-Bullying and School Safety. Now, there are a series of definitions that are listed. I will just simply highlight a couple of those for the benefit of this discussion. And it does address what is a personal electronic device. And what does that simply mean? Anything that has access to the internet, Wi-Fi, cellular, telephone signals, or captures images or video. This does include things such as cell phones, smartwatches, tablets, and gaming devices. Along with that comes the accessories that are accompanied by these personal electronic devices. Now, this policy talks about a school day and defining a school day. There was much conversation between a number of persons, namely our principals and directors, on several different occasions about what does the school day constitute. And what we determined is that the school day is a period of time defined as bell to bell, from the morning tardy bell until the afternoon dismissal, which is the conclusion of the instructional day. That constitutes, electronic devices will be prohibited. However, this policy does not include, and certainly not applicable on school buses, field trips, and during athletic events. Now, access as defined in this policy talks about the fact that during the school day, during that bell-to-bell in which we've referenced, the devices will be silenced and stored away as directed by the district, i.e. this particular policy. However, there are exceptions for medical necessities that might warrant such use for medical reasons for those students. There's further there's further language in this policy that talks about students, again, must store their accessories and or devices, store them away, silence the devices, whether that's in their lockers, book bags, if the students use lockers, I'm not sure, backpacks, or otherwise directed by the district. Another interesting thing that we included here, and when there was much discussion, I think even during our initial introductory of this, is about emergency situations. And that, in fact, during emergency situations, the district certainly reserves a right to grant exceptions in emergency situations while on school campuses. Again, the students have an IEP, an IAP, ideally a 504 combination plan, medical plan, IHP is often referred to. Then those students will certainly have opportunity and will be allowed, according to this policy, to access and to utilize their electronic devices for medical and or educational purposes. And finally, we conclude with how is this enforced? And this is enforced by way of the current Student Code of Conduct Handbook, which is outlined in categories 1 and in categories 2 under the classification or category of refusal to obey. That is the highlights almost to the letter or to the word in this particular revised policy, JICJ, prohibition of personal electronic devices during the school day. Certainly a recommendation of the administration that this would move forward to first reading. But I'll stand for questions you may have.
Any Mr. Hogan?
The definitions under personal electronic devices, I mean, I understand the nature of this policy is to keep cell phones out of schools. My concern more so the wearable devices and how those are going to be monitored and also how they're going to be disciplined. I mean, obviously Apple Watches, it's pretty clear what the intent of those are, but there's a lot of other wearables that have the ability to connect, but outside of it being a digital watch, that's pretty much it. Question I've gotten, it's really minuscule, but the last part of the under the definitions, it talks about capturing images or videos. Based on this, is a digital camera considered personal electronics? And that's, I mean, we can't connect to the internet, it doesn't transmit signals or anything else, but it can capture images and videos. So would that be considered personal electronic devices, and would a student be subjected to refusal to obey if they brought a digital camera in?
I think outside, I think we have courses and classes, photography and other courses that would use the digital cameras, and so those certainly would be permissible in those instances such as that.
Okay.
So they would have to be for a class. You couldn't have a digital camera.
Just for calls, then the answer to that would be no. But if it's certainly, that is specifically a class or courses that we offer, then the answer to that was yes, those would be permissible and be allowed to be utilized.
But you couldn't bring a camera to school to take like pictures of, you know, a field day or a pep rally or.
Film your TikToks.
Well, I think that's why we have this policy.
I
is
agree.
because
No, I agree. And that's
but
what
I'm
we're
just saying.
talking
But I mean.
But I mean, I guess that's kind of the question. Like, where's the line going to be drawn with personal devices as to what's acceptable? And really, I mean, the cell phones is very, I mean, it's understandable. I guess really where my hang-up's going to be is the wearable devices and how those are going to be implemented.
That was my hang-up until you brought up cameras. And Ms. Snipes. Oh, sorry.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't have any choice but to address wearable devices because that's in the state regulation, right? It's just how we define them,
This
correct?
is what's here is what's in the state regulations.
Okay, oh, just a suggestion, I'm assuming we're allowed to change the examples, though, for wearable devices that are in the policy. I would suggest, it's got BlackBerries in there, I don't even think you can buy a BlackBerry anymore, but it doesn't say Apple Watch, it doesn't say Fitbit. So, and I realize that may get out of date, so maybe that belongs in the R, but just more relevant examples. The other question I had is on, does the state's regulation say on school property, or does it say bell to bell, or what's the limitation?
And I wish I had that in front of me right this second. It references during the school day.
Okay, so
That's
I'm
what it
going to
references.
share some feedback I've had from parents, especially once you get into middle school, they're too young to drive, but yet they're in all these activities.
Sure.
You know, they're going to the doctor and the soccer and everything else. And I've heard from a number of parents that often near the end of the day, the plans change. And they want to be able to get in touch with their child and say, don't take the bus today. I'm going to need to pick you up today. I got you into the orthodontist early or whatever. And so the feedback, and I'm just sharing that I've heard is, could we say at the end of the school day and define it in such that there's at least a few minutes between the time class is over and they start calling for the car riders and the bus riders and all that, so that the student can get their device out and see if they have a message from their parents to alter their travel plans. So I've heard that. The other thing, and I'm not going to talk but once, so if it's all right, I'd like to share. Okay. I like natural consequences, and so I just put an idea out there that instead of a child getting in trouble, at least at first for this, that maybe the device goes to the office and the parent has to come get it, you know, or something like that. Just, you know, food for thought rather than anything going on a child's disciplinary record, especially for the first time that it happens. And then the other thing is, it says in here, or school-sponsored event. So that would be a football game?
That is correct.
Oh, boy, I don't know. I mean, kids, they love to take pictures, they video. I personally, that kind of hurts my heart, to be honest.
Are you looking at are you looking at the policy, the first policy, or are we looking at the revised policy?
Might have been looking at the revised one.
The revised
So
is
the
what's in
revised one
blue.
doesn't have the blackberries and apples stuff,
Okay,
but also I don't think it has the football. Oh my gosh.
It does not, so the revised policy does not say at school-sponsored events, correct?
Hold on, that's
Does
what I
not.
want, I want to make sure.
Okay.
Now, remember that we're given options.
Right.
So
Okay.
the options that we're talking about, which we got our feedback, is
Is
from
is
bell
it
to
is the
bell
one
to
in the
school
blue.
day. Right.
So
what's
that
in
does
blue,
not have the
right.
blackberries and
Okay.
apples, it
Right.
just says
Sorry, I was
smartphone. No,
confused.
it's okay. I just want to make sure, what you just said about like
That's a good
football
point.
games and after-school activities and things like that, I would think.
Okay, so my feedback would be, allow it then.
Allow it
and-
then.
And allow it on the bus, and allow it as soon as the class period ends, but before the announcements are made to go to the cars and the buses.
I think we addressed as well, I think Mr. Scully was about to say, the last sentence of C, this policy does not apply to school buses, field trips, and athletic events. So to whoever said about, with the video camera, taking pictures of field trips and stuff, obviously it wouldn't apply there, just inserting that.
Yeah. I think that we cut down, when we talked about it last time, we cut down the big, broad policy from the
did.
State Department and the blue policy that says revised policy. That's what we're looking at, right? I
That
just
is
want to make
correct.
sure I'm on
That
the
is
right
correct.
page.
That is correct. That is
Okay,
correct.
okay. Is that, you're good on that, Kathy? I just want to make sure, okay.
Yeah.
And I see what, okay. All right, I'm going to come down to Ms. Snipes and then Mr. Scully.
Following Ms. Huddle in terms of parent feedback, I had a question, just based on a parent thought, because they asked about using apps and like some of the marching bands, they use an app called like the Ultimate Drill Book. So it displays music and coordinates, for band. And so it made me wonder, if are we discouraging, teachers from using apps or things that would require a cell phone to make the policy just easier to manage, or is that still going to be discretionary?
I think, I appreciate the question, because one of the other things, just to give you another example, is about athletics. Athletic team oftentimes use an app that they communicate back and forth as well. So I think we can think of a number of different scenarios where an app of some sort might be utilized for some team or some organization. I think my response to that is that this can be as expansive or as limited as you as a board would choose for it to be. And I don't know that that's a direct answer, but that is a response that I really have here. We've tried to limit it to as best we could based on conversations and discussions that we had, and quite frankly, what administrators are going to work very, very hard to try to enforce. But even that's going to be a challenge. And so it can be as expansive or as limited as you choose for it to be.
Dr. Harris, if I can add something
Sure.
to that, to Dr. Harris's point, one of the challenges we're going to have is not every student has to put theirs away. So if I have an IEP and none of you will do not, I can have mine, and that's protected. So the question would be, if you ask, well, why does Akil get to have his and I don't? We can't identify that student for having an IEP or IHP. The other things that we're looking at, and we heard from the faculty advisory, is about instructional matters, to Ms. Snipes' point. There are some cases where the students are using some of their cameras capture 240 frames per second. So in physics class, they're using that because it's faster than the Chromebooks piece. So you do have in this policy some guidelines where, for instructional reasons, it has to be approved from the superintendent. And there'll be a lot of requests coming to me vis-a-vis Ms. McCaskill, but there is some leeway there. I think one of the things that we talk about right now is we're really doing this already in the classrooms now. I think our only issue for District 5 are the free zones. Because we've had this policy in place for the beginning of the year.
Right.
But it's the free zones, the change of class, the cafeteria, lunch duties. And one of our students, I won't name the school, but he said,
Yeah.
you know, when we talk to the students about it, of course, their opinion is totally different from the general consensus here. But they said, you know, it's 1,200 of us. When lunch, who governs the 1,200 to ensure that their watches are off? And so when we listened to the state board, to your point, we didn't want it to be punitive, but we do take on some liabilities when we go to seizing and taking phones as well. So one of our main goals is to keep winning in the classroom, and then we tackle these free zones by reducing that cell phone use. But I just want to make it where when we talk with the students, we're the only ones talking about the enforcement of it and its implementation. So I wanted to make that aware to the board here. But sorry, Dr. Harris.
Yeah, we gave them 5 minutes of being administrators, so they were thinking that was their thought process, so we appreciated that.
Yeah, most of my questions were answered by that discussion. I was going to ask about the athletics and how they communicate through those apps. But I'll also echo your thoughts about the enforcement. I took a group of middle schoolers to the Dutch Fork game last week, and in the car ride, I was asking, hey, how's blah, 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 and they're like, oh, so-and-so's mean, they just enforce they keep asking us to put our cell phones up, and so that is definitely on their minds. But to the point about Ms. Huddle, they do still have their Chromebooks, and parents can still communicate over email that way.
They can't communicate over email unless they have a
Can you
district
not?
email, right? Am
Don't
I-
students have emails? They don't?
Well, but I don't think that they can receive outside emails, right?
Yeah, I don't
They
believe.
can't, they can
I don't believe
only
students
email
can.
to district emails, so
Okay.
you. That's right?
So
Right,
no,
so they
you
couldn't.
can't. Okay, so there's really no way to.
Right.
Yes.
Mr. Satterfield.
Yeah, I was just going to offer a little insight on some of those concerns. Number one is, at the end of the day, you probably have 3 to 4 parents trying to get in touch with kids, and they can call into the classroom and just say, Ms. Hines, you're going to be a bus rider today. It's really not a difficult charge to do that. I couldn't imagine all the kids start getting their phones out, and some of them getting out too early, or they're anticipating getting all their phones out. But it's not a logistical nightmare for a parent to call the front office and say, tell Ms. Hines or Rebecca, if you were a kid, that she's going to be a bus rider today, and that's not an issue. What you talked about with the not being on the discipline record, we don't keep discipline records for long. That's not in their personal record or anything like that. But you were partially right in what you said, and the rule used to be that if I took Kevin's cell phone from him, then Kevin's mom would have to come and sign for it and agree that Kevin would not have that cell phone out again. The only way Kevin really got in trouble is if he refused to give me his cell phone. So that would be the refusal to obey. So I'm not sure how it was you were planning on refusing to follow the rules to obey, or just refusing to give it up.
I think it's inclusive of both of those.
Yeah, but it was very powerful when I would go in and I'd say, I'm sorry, Matt, I need your cell phone because you had it out. And Matt would give it to me, and then Matt's mom or dad had to come to the office after school or during school and pick it up, and then they'd fuss at Matt, and there was not any discipline involved, but you were able to enforce the rules, so to speak. But typically, unless something crazy has changed, students' discipline, when they do knuckleheads throughout the year, the schools expect those kind of, the kids are growing up. So we don't keep these in permanent records or anything like that, just so you know.
All right, anyone else? All right. Appreciate you, Dr. Harris. Thank you very much. This is a fun policy, isn't it? Yeah, no complaints. All right, that moves us to number 18 on the agenda, the discussion of fund balance assignment recommendations. Dr. Ross.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board, and our community. I want to make a recommendation for a fund balance assignment. As you're aware, go back to June 10th when we approved the FY 24-25 school year budget. Within that budget was the fund balance assignment for the employee retention incentives to be paid in November. And there was a $1.5 million purchase of portable classrooms. This would require board approval prior to purchase. Looking at the growth projections that I predicted for Chapin, those did not manifest. And so while there is growth in Chapin, there's not to the point that we would need portables for this year. As a result, I am asking the board to reallocate. This is one-time money. It will not reoccur. And so to use it for one-time purposes of equipment. I think for us, we have a safety and security budget, but I would like to add a third of this money to additional security requests. That would be outlined as follows. When we bought the fleet vehicles for our safety officers, we bought them, they weren't new, so we would like to replace those aging vehicles there. We would also like to implement additional screening at our high schools with the open gate weapons detection systems for athletic and mobile events as well. We would like to service those with some additional adapters for those open gates. We would also like to pay for what's called delayed egress systems and badge readers that go with the delayed egress systems. We discussed that under our security briefing for executive session. And then because this is one-time money, we would like to do a set-aside of $7,500 for maintenance of these security requests. And again, this is to add $500,000 of equipment one time to our additional security and safety and security budget. The $1 million, the 2/3 of that money, I would like to, with the board's permission, to do something to help out our music programs. Our band and orchestra, as everyone knows, is a huge part of the instructional and educational program. I think it should be made aware to the board that after 2008, our records show that the band and orchestra equipment was removed from annual capital. If you have ever been a part of band or orchestra, these are not These are very expensive instructional materials that they receive, or equipment, and it used to be a part of the annual capital rotation. In 2008, that was removed. In FY 22-23, band and orchestra came to us asking for funding, since they were removed, to replace theirs. Our previous CFO, Marty Rolls, was able to find $20,000 and funds to give them, but they're still behind. We asked them last year, all of our band and orchestra, to give us an outline of your level ones. If you can recall, when we did our work for the facilities conditions report, we had 5 levels, 5 being the best, 1 being the worst. We asked, what are your level 1 needs for band and orchestra? They identified $1.7 million of band and orchestra equipment that need to be replaced immediately. We would like to take a large chunk of that. As you can see, the majority of that would go to intermediate and middle schools, because they don't fundraise to the tune of the high schools to replace some of their band equipment. To get out of this totally, they would need to be placed back into our 8% annual renewal in order to get a program there. So with this one-time money for equipment, it did not manifest for the portables in Chapin, but I think we have an opportunity to try to make right 16-year-old removal of capital out of these band and orchestra programs. It still doesn't take care of all of their need, but then we can come back at this budget cycle and look at maybe a replacement cycle in the 8% capital. So this is our request to the administration recommend the reallocation of the 1.5 that was in that for portable classrooms, one time for security, additional needs, and one time for band and orchestra. And I believe this is symphonic band and orchestra. This is not the marching band. So this is really those classroom materials there. So that is just for discussion today, Madam Chair, and I stand for questions.
Yeah, Dr. Ross, just for clarification, the need based on that chart was 1.7 for band and an additional 1.7 for orchestra. So this would be 1.5 out of a total of 3.4.
No, the total need was 1.7, so it was 131,000 for orchestra and 1.6 for band.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you.
So the total need was 1.7.
So this would very nearly account for the full need at this point in time. Okay.
Dr.
The question, are students still required to rent instruments?
Correct. Students are still required to bring instruments, but there's a lot of instruments that are in the classroom that are not able to bring back and forth on the bus, tubas and drums and some of the bigger instruments that they need a classroom set for. And those are the instruments that have gotten progressively older, past the point of being repaired and would like to be replaced.
My light went out. One of the things we might want to look at in the future is all our band programs, even the marching band programs. We have a lot of students. We're highly dependent on volunteers and parents donating and parents supplementing for kids who would like to be actively involved, but their parents can't afford it, and the kids can't afford it, because it can be quite costly, I can tell you. And anybody who's been involved in education for any period of time know band is huge with academic success. There are so many, research shows us that kids that are involved in, if they have any ties with school, be it athletics or anything, but marching band and the orchestra is huge as far as for kids. And I would hate to see any kid miss out on an opportunity because their parents can't afford the instrument. So I really think it's the responsibility of our school district to provide that stuff for those kids, so I'm for it.
Anybody else? Ms. Huddle?
So, just to follow up on the question about, so I'll just use an example. If you want to play the violin in the 8th grade, do you have to rent the violin from the school? Do you have to pay money for it?
So the school contracts with musical facilities around, and people, I know from personal experience, we rented a violin for my son last year.
Okay,
we
so
personally paid for it.
that's to, well, let me back up. If, I apologize, I got a frog in my throat. If this parent can't afford to do that, can they get a violin to play at school?
I was gonna say.
Yes,
go
there
ahead.
are, there
Okay.
are some,
But they can't take it home, is that right?
actually, some of them are taken home.
Okay, I'm very supportive of this, but could we maybe, since this is just discussion before we vote, just get more, I think it would be interesting to find out, because to Mr. Satterfield's point, there's studies that show direct correlation between math and musical participation. And I'd also be curious, like, how do we keep ourselves from getting in this position again? And does it really need to be capital? Because it's something we probably ought to be doing every year, is replacing some of the older instruments and repairs on some of the instruments. So I'd be curious, you know, if we approve this, what we could put in the annual operating budget just to keep up to date on all of that. And
If I can respond to that.
yeah,
So I would look at, historically, what we've looked at is, historically, the band directors were given kind of two accounts. So they would put in their annual 8%, and then they had maintenance. So their maintenance was in operating, and I'll just take the band director. The nicks, the dings, the drops, the tunes, all of that happens. They would use their maintenance, their operating money to handle that. And so last year, we kind of injected a little bit more money into operating. But then they were on a rotating scale of big capital expenditures. And so when technology came in with the Chromebooks, I think, and I'm not saying that's exactly what happened, but that's right around the time that their annual rotation of these huge expenditures went out, because we're talking about $300,000 purchases. One of those line items on your operating will consume you. So because it was on that rotating, every band director, orchestra director, they knew their rotation. I think even choirs were getting a reallocation of stands and equipment. So I think to not be in this situation again, it's really looking, if we can take $1 million off of their plate right now, how do we do long-term on another $700,000? And that's just on their level ones. I would make the point, though, if a student is reduced lunch, then I thought the fees didn't apply at reduced lunch or free lunch. Now, I can tell you this, where there are a lot of participants, then you use the school's equipment or the school's instruments, or you have a very, and there might be a lot of participants and not enough violins or not enough violas. Where our programs are very small, there's tons of, so it's really based on the size of the orchestra or the band, but they can use the instruments at the school. Our issue is when they go home, they don't always come back in that same condition, so they sign that contract. But in terms of rental fees, if it's free or reduced, then if it's free, you don't pay. If it's reduced rental.
Dr. Ross, I had a couple questions. One, so when we talk about the $1 million, according to the recommendation, the $1 million towards band equipment, the $500,000 towards security, when is that money actually going to be spent?
We would get on the security right away. I don't know how the appeal process works for the band equipment. And I'm looking at Heather, putting you on the spot. I don't know if you know either.
We would have to look at the individual needs and probably put out some feelers for bids because of the cost.
And kind of going to that question with, you listed the band costs by schools, and you have the intermediate schools and the middle schools in this, and it's my understanding that the intermediate school model is going to dissolve after this year, and we're gonna have the middle schools. So is that being taken into account when we are budgeting,
Yes, ma'am.
Crossroads is no longer gonna be Crossroads with just sixth grade. So how does that split into Irma Middle and Dutch Fork Middle?
So we had, and we can give you the background documents on this. Mr. Stephen Puckett worked with the directors, and we have basically two we call standard programs. And this, it's a middle school and a high school standard program. That's kind of the end that I know, and he knows how many sousaphones, how many saxophones, how many bass, per middle school program, how many cellos, how many violas, how many violins per middle school program. So even though these are tagged to an intermediate school, they will be moving to a middle school program.
Okay. And then my last question is more about the allocation of the money and the amounts per band versus security. And this might not be a popular opinion. I totally understand that academic success is tied into the arts, into band, and even to athletics, everything. I get that, and I think that's very important. And I don't mean to negate that at all by what I'm about to say. We've gotten so many emails about school security, and there's been so many situations that have happened in our state, beyond our state, and so I've spoken to a lot of concerned parents every school has their security concerns. So when I look at this and I see $1 million for band and $500,000 to security, and I look at what the items are on the security line item, I'm not taking that away from that at all. I am concerned that, school security is the most important responsibility to protect our kids. So
If I can speak to
I
that,
guess
Madam Chair.
I'm talking out loud, thinking out loud. Those numbers bother me, and
I would like to say this, and I appreciate that. I think to be clear, while on this form it looks like we're putting less to security, I would say in terms of our overall expenditure, this is not exhaustive of our security spend. We're probably dipping into more instructional things on the operations side, so this kind of relieves that so that we can, because as you said, security is job one. We're hearing of things just back there of things that are job one. So we're never finished with security. Dr. Harris knows. He says that as soon as you put it in place, you got to keep iterating because things that can be defeated. But this is not exhaustive of our security spend. And I think if you wanted to speak to that,
I was
Ms.
going to
Tucker.
say, Ms. Hines, so just looking at what we spent the last couple of years on things like security cameras, door alarms, vestibule refinishings, and fencing, we spent over $2 million. So these are just the above and beyond the things that have come up in recent that were not planned for over and above based on some of the things that are happening. So just additional concerns, but we are spending millions on security.
right. And I am aware of that. I'm not taking away from that, but I still think that we have parents that are concerned, and we have and every school is different. The way that it is set up, and like you said, we've talked about it. Every school is set up. Their needs are different, and as we're looking at this money, I am just thinking about, what. I'm thinking out loud. This is a discussion part of what we're looking at for this allocation. So I'm just concerned that I think I've said my concerns. I'm just curious.
Can I add something to your comments? You're right. You're right. Unfortunately, what happens a lot of times is we're reactionary.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of folks, I know I've talked to parents too, and they want us to be more proactive. It's just hard when we have buildings that were built 20 and 30 years ago, and older than that, because they weren't, at that time, we did not face the issues that we're facing now. So, but I agree with that. I don't know I know that Dr. Ross has a security team, and they do their very best at trying to be preventative, so to speak, and make sure that our students and faculty and visitors are safe. Dr. Ross, do y'all have, do they attend or do they visit other places? Are they looking at updated and modern security ideas and things that other schools are doing?
Yes, and we have, Dr. Harris puts together a team. If you just want to just kind of go through your task force and the people that we have on it in terms of our security prep.
Certainly, and to be very specific to your question, Mr. Satterfield, regularly is the response to whether or not they are vetting other options in and around near and far. That is something that we practice and we do on a regular basis. In contact with a number of different organizations locally and state, even at the federal level in terms of the FBI, if you want to include them as well. We have also established an emergency responders advisory. I think that's one of the advisories that has at least 30 or 40 participants every time we hold a meeting. That's just one, and that starts with, and I'll call them by name, that starts with Chief Keel from SLED, all the way down to our current and in-house safety officers and everything in between, all the municipalities that are included. So that's just one example. There are multiple examples, multiple meetings, multiple tabletops that occur over the course of the year. So that conversation is held regularly and repeatedly throughout the course of the year.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I know that when there's something that comes up, if it's in another part of the state or in another state, it creates a lot of anxiety for parents and teachers and kids. So I know there's no easy answer. I've been in that position of trying to do my best to ensure the safety of everybody, but thank you for continuing to look and search for new and better ideas, so to speak. Thank you.
Ms. Barnhart?
Just a quick question. For the safety officer vehicles, how many are we looking at replacing?
I think our goal is 3.
What car dealership are you going to? I'm just kidding.
Just curious at
But
$90,000.
Mr. Wiseman is going to be credited with
pre-owned.
finding all of those cars for $90,000.
We understand that initial money is not going to buy 3. So we have a plan on how we would get the third. We actually have 4 vehicles, and let me go back. The big black SUVs were bought through government sales. They were 6-7 years old with 80,000 miles on them, somewhere around there. Great deal for those vehicles for $25,000. Unfortunately, because of the miles that our guys put on them, the wear and tear on them is just getting greater and greater. So we're looking at upgrading to, we hope, a similar vehicle, but again, we got to go out and we got to bid it out. We got to look what the needs of the schools are, or the security guys are, make sure they have the right equipment on the inside. I will tell you, I know I can't buy 3 or 4 for $90,000. I understand that, but I've got to start somewhere.
I definitely think those are vehicles
going
that
here
need to be in the best top shape with the least amount of miles for the amount of things that they do in this district. So hopefully we can get some
Okay.
good options.
Mr. Scully, and then I'll come back to Ms. Huddle.
Yeah, I'm going to flip back to the band. On the, I know the $1 million is for replacing equipment. Can you talk about, from an enrollment perspective, how does, and I know this is instructional classroom band classes, but what does our enrollment look like historically up to, over the last 20 years or so in those classes? I know it's not marching band, but I don't see inside the classrooms, I see on the fields, and there's a visible and noticeable shrinkage in the marching band sizes. Have the classroom bands and orchestras experienced the same, or what are we looking at from enrollment?
I'll share my thoughts, and if Ms. McCaskill has more data, then please join in. But I feel that to that point of affordability and exposure, to have a great high school band, you have to start early. The earlier those children start with the music, the better they're going to be prepared for that. One of the things that we deal with is, let's say, marching band, which you see on Friday nights. If you arrive in high school with no experience on instrumentation, it is hard to go to drill, right? And so you have to have those students as early as fifth grade. Now, if mom and dad have me exposed to music in the third grade, then I'm first chair coming in. So the earlier we can get them exposure to that, the better. By having more instruments in our fleet, we can give more students that opportunity. So I can tell you, even though some of these can't be used for symphonic band or marching, they can certainly be used for intro classes to help students get more exposure.
And that was part of my question is there anything additional that you need to do or you'll focus on in efforts to increase enrollment and bring people into those programs? And it sounds like other than just replacing the equipment, we'll still have additional on hand that will help us to increase those numbers.
Yes, sir.
It doesn't impact the funds that we're talking about here, but it makes me think about it when we talk about security, because, I mean, I agree with you, and I don't like to think there's a choice. I think that, you know, there's money and already set aside, as Ms. Tucker said, and then there'll probably be more for security. So I guess one thing I would like to do is maybe, and I think this probably has to be an executive session because it's security, but I would really like us to look at, and I mean, I hate to bring this up, but the tragedies that have happened in the country in the last year, and just, you know, relook at what are some of the tools that other schools are using. And I appreciate that, you know, we're doing that with our security team, but also for the board to hear that and hear what some alternatives are. I mean, I think about like the badge thing that the teachers had in Georgia. Is that something that we should be looking at? And we've never really, since I've been on the board that I can remember, really had a discussion about having metal detectors. So, and I'm not saying we should, I just think we need to have that discussion.
I would agree. I feel like there's more that we can do that is not on this list. I think that's why I'm conflicted with where all of the money is going here. I know that we've spent a lot of money on security measures, but I don't know that it's enough. And I agree. Some of my feelings I don't necessarily want to say out here because they are security issues. So I would agree with that. I do have a question. Flipping back to band again. My last question about band. But do we know how many students buy or rent their own instruments? Because I feel like most, I could be wrong, that we have a decent amount of kids that do rent or buy their own instruments because they want to. And how that, well, the reason I'm asking is how does that impact, like we're saying we want to buy all of, we want to buy all of these pieces of equipment. Or I'm just trying to figure out how we're getting to that number.
I can tell you a little bit about it. First of all, it depends on the grade and it depends on the instrument. So in your younger grades where the kids are still like, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to do this instrument? A lot of times they're not purchased. And it doesn't even matter if the family can afford it. They just don't want to buy a violin and then.
But if the family's renting it, and I don't mean rent versus buy. I mean like how many kids are renting or buying themselves versus how many instruments does the district have to buy?
Yeah, that would be good to know.
That's what I mean.
But the other thing is when you get a really large instrument,
you don't want to carry it around.
They can't. I mean, you can't take a cello on a bus.
Right.
So what happens, and this is where the divide happens too, which is unfortunate, is if the child can't rent one on their own, the only practice time they get is at school. And then they lose interest because they fall behind. Right. So I really would love to have the broader discussion of how all that works, because if we're going to commit to it, let's commit to it, you know, and figure out a way that every child can participate no matter what their situation.
Right, no, I agree. Mr. Hogan.
And I'm echoing the comments of everybody. I'm not against the band by any way, shape, or form. I'm not against security. I guess looking at it and seeing, you know, 1.5 is a lot of money no matter how we cut it. $1 million towards band is a lot of money no matter how it's cut, and $500,000 towards security is a lot of money. But with the decision that our community gets to make on the ballot in November, safety and security is first and foremost on that. And if I heard Ms. Tucker correct, if this was to be reallocated, there would have to be bids, for the suppliers for the band. I guess my ask for the administration would be, if this was to go forward, if it was to make a decision, if there's not an opportunity to be funded with referendum, that this million would come back to look to see where it could be applied to address some of the safety and security items that the referendum was intended to do. So that's my ask.
All right, any other
But-
discussion on this?
On top of that ask, I would like to get the band back on rotation. I do, Richland 2, I
Wanna get the
believe,
band back
has.
together?
Get the band back together, yeah. No, I think Richland 2 has it on rotation. I believe every third year, their clusters get, how much? Election 1, yeah. So getting it back on rotation would keep it where it wouldn't be such an absorbent amount of money at one time.
Yeah. All right, anybody else on this? Mr. Hogan,
I'd like to make a motion that we adjourn.
do I have a second?
Second.
Ms. Snipes, I heard Ms. Snipes, sorry. Any discussion? All in favor? That motion carries 7-0. We will adjourn until October.